Okay, so I think we can start now. So yeah, just as a general reminder, uh, the speaker will be speaking, and in due time, if you have any questions, just type in your question in the chat, or just type in a Q or something so that we can, yeah, we can remember who had a question, and yeah, we'll ask you to unmute after the speaker has stopped speaking. And yeah, okay, Vedant, whenever you're ready.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my talk on neutrinos and the India-based Neutrino Observatory. So I would like to begin by putting a part of a poem, Cosmic Gall, Neutrino, by John Updike. Neutrinos, they are very small, they have no charge and have no mass. So this is not quite true. They do have a very tiny mass, and we'll get to that, and do not interact at all. Again, this is not entirely true. They have a tiny interaction. The Earth is just a silly ball to them through which they simply pass, like dustmates through a drafty hall or photons through a sheet of glass. All right. So the plan of the talk is like this. I would start with an introduction to neutrinos, and I'll spend some time on neutrino oscillations, a phenomena that was discovered about 20 years ago. And then we'd move on to some of the experiments that have been conducted in the past to detect neutrinos and the observations that we have had. And then we'll move on to the neutrino observatory that they're planning to build in India, the INO, and the prototype or the model that they've built at Madurai for this. Okay, so let's begin. An introduction to neutrinos. So neutrino was proposed by Pauli in 1930 to solve the problem of continuous energy spectrum of betas in beta decay. So we all know beta decay. We have a neutron which converts into a proton and an electron and an antineutrino. So originally we of course did not know about the neutrino, and in this reaction there was a problem of conservation of energy and the conservation of angular momentum. And it was solved in one stroke by Pauli by hypothesizing a new particle. So he just said that there's a new particle and which has a very small mass and is just neutral. Now, of course, Pauli was very hesitant to do that because he knew that the particle he was proposing would be extremely hard to detect. And in fact, Niels Bohr had a much more radical solution, and he suggested that maybe laws of conservation of energy and angular momentum are basically not true or they are not followed in beta decay. However, it turned out that Pauli was indeed right, and we do have neutrinos. Then a couple of years later, Piles and Bethe, these two gentlemen over here, they calculated the neutrino cross section, interaction cross section for MEV neutrino, and they found out that it is 20 orders of magnitude smaller than a typical nuclear cross section. So cross section, you must be knowing, it is related to the probability of detection of the particle or the mean free path of the particle, and it is generally measured in barns. And so what Pius and Bethe, this showed that it had such a large mean free path, it had such a low cross section that it would essentially not be possible to detect it. And so if we do a simple calculation, we can find out that the mean free path of a neutrino turns out, MEV neutrino turns out to be 10 to the power 16 kilometers. So if you look at the Earth, you take the twice the radius of the Earth, you find the interaction probability to be about 10 to the power minus 12. So you can imagine how difficult it is to detect a neutrino. Most of them would just pass through the Earth as if it's nothing. It's not even there. So Yeah, so this is about the interaction cross section. Then later, Fermi gave the first quantum theory for beta decay, and he too calculated the cross section, and which turned out to be very similar to what was calculated by Piles and Bethe. Okay, so this, as most of you would recognize, is a standard model for particle physics. And just to go through it briefly, over here we have the quarks, which interact through the strong interaction or the so-called color interaction, and they form the most of the particles that we see, which are the mesons, the protons, neutrons, and so on. And up and down are the most common and the stable quarks, while the other charm, strange top and bottom quarks are heavy and they decay. So they are unstable. They decay to these lighter quarks. Similarly, you have the leptons, and leptons, you basically have two categories of leptons, the charged leptons and the uncharged leptons. So charged leptons we're familiar with, electron, and then you have its elder cousins, if you might call them, muon and the tau particle. Again, the muon and the tauon are unstable and they decay. And tauon is, in fact, very extremely rare to see. Uh, then we have their corresponding neutrinos, which are uncharged. So you have the electron neutrino, the muon neutrino, and the tau neutrino. And then we have the force carriers, the photon and gluon, which are the force carriers of the electromagnetic force and the strong force, respectively, and the W and Z bosons, which carry the weak force or the weak interaction. They're responsible for beta decay, for example. And lastly, we have the Higgs boson, the so-called God particle, which gives masses to these quarks and leptons. We still don't know how it gives masses to neutrinos, which we'll come to in a bit. So coming back to neutrinos, the electron neutrino, though it was said that it would be almost impossible to detect, just 20 years after the prediction of Piles and Bethe, it was indeed detected at a nuclear reactor experiment. And Reines was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1995 for the discovery. Then we have the muon neutrino, which was discovered at an accelerator-based experiment, not a nuclear reactor. And these three gentlemen were awarded the Nobel Prize for it. And similarly, the tau neutrino was discovered in a collaboration at Fermilab. So let us go through some of the properties of neutrinos. So first, the electric charge of a neutrino is zero, they're neutral. We've already stated that. So the mass of an electron neutrino is less than 2.2 eV by c squared. So for the mass, we only have an upper bound. We don't know the exact mass of the neutrino. In fact, if you were to go out and measure the mass, you would find that you would not have a single number. You would get three measurements. You get three kinds of masses, which is because of the mixing phenomena, which is because of neutrino oscillations, which we'll come to. Then neutrinos only interact weakly with matter. So this is, of course, apart from the gravitational interaction, that is all encompassing. Anything with mass or energy interacts via gravity. So the weak interaction, uh, but it's still pretty weak compared to the other forces, which is why it interacts so little. Then the next property, this is actually very important. We don't know the answer to this, that whether neutrinos are their own antiparticles. So if you take the example of a photon, it is its own antiparticle, while you have an electron which has its separate antiparticle, which is called the positron. So for a neutrino, it is neutral. So on principle, it can be its own antiparticle, but we don't know that for sure. And even 90 years after it was first proposed, we still don't have an answer to this question. In fact, yeah. So if it is its own antiparticle, it will go by the name of Majorana fermion. Otherwise, it will go by Dirac. And then, of course, neutrinos oscillate, which we'll come to in a greater detail later. Now, neutrinos are the second most abundant particle in the universe. The first most abundant is photon, which is about 400 odd particles per centimeter cube, if you take the average across the universe. And neutrinos are very close, they're 300 odd particles per centimeter cube. So they're extremely abundant, and yet they interact so little. So we come to the sources of neutrinos, and so first source we have is the sun. The sun is a very strong source. If you take the tip of your finger, which is say about a square centimeter, there are approximately 60 billion neutrinos passing through it every second. But of course, they hardly interact, so we don't notice it. In fact, in your whole lifetime, there would, if you do the calculation, there would be barely a handful of neutrinos that interact with your body. The next source is nuclear reactors. So currently, of course, we have fission reactions, and in a fission reaction, the products, the fragments that we obtain are neutron rich, and anything that's neutron rich would go undergo beta decay. And as we explained already, we have neutrinos over there. So each fission reaction approximately leads to about 6 neutrinos being formed. And we can estimate, so using these numbers, you can like estimate if you have a 1 gigawatt nuclear reactor, say like that at Kudankulam, you can figure out how many neutrinos you expect it to emit. So it's a good source for neutrinos for uh, experiments or measurements. Then we have particle accelerators. The first particle accelerator used to detect neutrino was the AGS synchrotron, which was a 26 giga electron volt reactor accelerator. Sorry, and we don't. That was the first one. Now we have many accelerators that are used for this purpose. So you get a very focused beam of neutrinos using accelerators. Then we come to atmospheric neutrinos. So these are the most important for this talk. We have so what these neutrinos essentially come from the cosmic rays. So cosmic rays consist mostly of protons, and when they strike the Earth, like when they interact with the upper atmosphere, which is mainly oxygen and nitrogen nuclei, they produce pions, and these pions, as I said, are unstable. They decay to form a muon and a new mu. And a muon, which is still unstable, it further decays to give you an electron, a new mu, and a new e. So if you look at the reactions, you get two muon type of neutrinos for every electron type of neutrinos. So yeah, this ratio is extremely important. We'll come to it again when we discuss the specific experiments. Next we have is supernovae, and supernovae are an extremely strong source of neutrinos. In fact, 99% of the energy coming out from a supernova is in the form of a neutrino. So there are a huge number of neutrinos emitted. We have, in fact, detected these neutrinos from a supernova explosion in just one event in the SN 1987A explosion. So we detected neutrinos specifically from the supernova. And the last source we have is the Big Bang. Now, so we have neutrinos that were formed at when the universe came into being, and these constitute most of the background neutrinos that we have. However, these neutrinos, after so much time, are extremely low in energy, and we haven't detected the Big Bang neutrinos. So, if these were to be detected, they would help in a lot of studies and to analyze the early stages of the universe, and would most likely fetch a Nobel Prize as well. So next we talk about the various kinds of,
Veda,
yes.
I think your screen went away. Can you share it again?
Okay, let me check. Is it visible now?
Yes, Veda.
Okay, okay. So next we'll talk about the various kinds of interactions that neutrinos have. So first is electron scattering. So just like a photon can scatter off an electron, we have a neutrino which can also do that. The elastic scattering. Then the next interaction we have is something that's called a charged current quasi-elastic reaction. So you have a neutrino which interacts with a nucleon and produces the corresponding charged lepton. So if you have a new mu, it will produce a muon. If you have a new e, it will produce an electron, and so on. So this is all quite an interesting reaction. In fact, you can use this to detect neutrinos because because neutrinos are neutral, and to detect a neutral particle is extremely difficult in comparison to detecting a charged particle. There are multiple ways to detect a charged particle. So this is a preferred reaction that is used to detect the neutrinos. That you let them interact with matter, and they will produce the corresponding charged lepton, and then you can measure the or detect the corresponding lepton. Then the other reactions are a little more complicated. We have the resonances for the nucleons. These also produce the corresponding charged lepton, and they also produce a pion. And next we have is deep inelastic scattering. So in this, essentially what happens is at very high energies, the wavelength of a neutrino becomes so small that it becomes smaller than the size of the nucleon. So you can actually, so the neutrino can actually see the individual quarks that constitute the nucleon, and so it can scatter off from the quarks instead of the whole particle. So that is deep inelastic scattering. So this is a graph of the various cross sections of the different reactions. So don't have to worry about the exact details. These are relevant in which energy scale do you want to detect the neutrinos. So you choose a reaction accordingly. All right. So now let's come to neutrino oscillations. So I have here a quote from Bacall, John Bacall, who was very influential in the neutrino experiments, early neutrino experiments, and he, along with Davis, actually proposed the solar neutrino experiment. So the quote is like this: solar neutrinos have a multiple personality disorder. They are created as electron neutrinos in the sun, but on the way to the Earth, they change their type. For neutrinos, the origin of the personality disorder is a quantum mechanical process called neutrino oscillations. So what essentially happens is if you start with a particular flavor of a neutrino, and on its path it can spontaneously change into another flavor, and it can these changes can keep happening, and it can also go back to its original flavor. That is why we call it neutrino oscillations. So, what is the mechanism of neutrino oscillations? Why do they occur? So, we can basically describe neutrinos in two ways according to their flavor, which is electronness, muonness, or tauness, or we can describe them in terms of their masses. So, the least mass to the highest mass. Now, it so happens that these are not the same, they don't correspond directly, but since we're talking about the same particles, there has to be some way to describe these, right? So let me explain that with an example. Let's suppose we have a vector in 2D space. Now you would represent it with a set of x and y coordinates. Right. Now, if I have another set of coordinates which are rotated to this original frame, I will have a different pair of x and y coordinates. But these two coordinate systems can be related through one rotation angle, or more specifically, you can write a matrix that you can left multiply to a vector to get a vector in a different frame. So you can do a similar thing for these neutrinos, and so you relate them through a vector, through a matrix. Now the difference over here is that we have three mixing angles. So instead of just one rotation angle in my analogy, here we have more parameters. We have three mixing angles and one parameter for the CP violation, which I will not get to in at the moment. So you can describe these neutrinos, electron, muon, and tau neutrinos, in terms of their masses and vice versa. So if we do a calculation, we can find out what is the probability for a neutrino, say of one type, say a muon neutrino, to remain a muon neutrino, and you get this expression: 1 minus sine square 2 theta sine square some factor times delta m square times L by E, where delta m square is the square difference of the squares of the masses, L is the propagation distance, and E is the energy of the neutrino. So here you can see that if theta, the mixing angle, was zero, this would be zero and the probability would be one. So the neutrino would not change its flavor. It would always remain the same type of neutrino. On the other hand, if you had delta m square equal to zero, then again the same thing would happen. This term would go to zero and the probability would be 1. So this in a way is an indication that the neutrinos must have some mass, and these masses must be different for the different types of neutrinos, because originally the standard model predicted that the neutrinos must be massless. So this is so the fact that we see neutrino oscillations is proof that they cannot be massless, and they must have some mass which would differ. And in fact, this is what forms the basis of the disappearance experiment. So you can, you know the amount of, so you know the number of neutrinos of a certain type that you expect to detect. And then when you detect them, you have a reduced amount that is detected. So you know that some of the neutrinos along the path have been converted into a different type. So they have essentially disappeared. So that's the disappearance experiment. Now this is for two flavor mixing. Of course, we have three flavors, so it gets a little more complicated than this. So we come to the neutrino mass spectrum. So these are the calculated values for M21, delta M21, and delta M32, the squares of them, of course. And here you can see that delta M21 is much smaller than delta M32. This value is a few orders of magnitude smaller. And so this is the one that is relevant for solar neutrinos, and we'll come to why. And this is the one that's relevant for atmospheric neutrinos. So how do we relate these masses M1, M2, and M3? So if you remember the delta M squared, it is a difference of the masses. So we really don't know which one is larger or which one is smaller. So we can have, we need to find out the mass ordering of the neutrinos. So we have, so currently we have this. We already know that M21 is greater than, so M2 is greater than M1, and I'll explain why that is the case. But we don't know what M3 is, whether it is smaller or larger than M2. So we only know the gap. We only know this difference. So these are the two possible hierarchies or the mass orderings that we currently have. You can have M1 and M2, and M3, if M3 is larger than M2 and M1, you can have such a kind of mass ordering, or else you can have an inverted sort of mass ordering where M3 would be the lightest. Now, we don't know, as I said in the beginning of the talk, we don't know the actual masses of the neutrinos, and we don't know the masses of the separate types, and we don't know their ordering. All we know is these differences, and this is how we can arrange. And you can see over here how the mixing of the different flavors of neutrinos. So what are the approximate ratios of mixing for these? So yeah, we don't know the absolute mass scale as well. So we don't know what these masses actually are. So how do we know that M2 is greater than M1? We do know that through something called matter effects. So what happens is, like, take the example of a photon that is passing through glass. So a photon would gain a sort of effective mass as it interacts with the electrons in the matter. and it gains an effective mass and it slows down. Similarly, electron type of neutrinos, not any other kind, electron neutrinos can also interact with matter electrons, and that changes the mixing angles. So nu E interacts with matter electrons, and so you get a change in mixing angle that was given by these gentlemen. And this is the formula. So the formula is not important over here. What is important is this value A. And A, you can see what A is. It is some constant times the Fermi coupling times the electron density, so yes, of the matter material it's going through, and you have the energy of the neutrino. So if you look at this term, you have this term and this term over here are the same, while you have this delta 2 1 cos 2 theta minus A. So if you have, if delta 2 1 is positive and your A is positive, now A depends on whether it's a neutrino or an antineutrino. For a neutrino, A is positive. For an antineutrino, A is negative. So if these two are positive, you can see that for some value, these two can cancel each other out. And if you look at the overall equation, it looks like a resonance equation. So if these two cancel out, you would if these two cancel out, you would get the numerator and denominator would be equal, and you'd get one. So sine square 2 theta would be one. This theta m. So m stands for matter. So what would happen is, even if you started with a small mixing angle, a small theta, when the neutrino enters this material, it can get the resultant mixing angle. And the mixing angle in that material can be extremely large. So you can have this is 1, so 2 theta is 90 degrees, so theta is 45 degrees. So you can get a very large mixing angle, and through that you can distinguish and you can find out that M2 has to be greater than M1. Yes. Now, if theta was 0, then of course this would be 0 and that wouldn't be relevant. But for some small theta, you can do this. All right. So what is the experimental evidence for neutrino oscillations? So we come to, first we talk about the atmospheric neutrinos, and these were the first ones that gave a very clear evidence for neutrino oscillations. So as I explained the mechanism for that, your cosmic ray, which is most likely a proton, it interacts with a nitrogen or oxygen nucleus and produces a pion, which produces a muon and a nu mu, which produces an electron, a nu mu, and a nu e. So in this, you expect that there would be two nu mu's for every nu e, or two muon type of neutrinos for every electron type of neutrino. That is the ratio that you expect. However, when we do the measurements, we find that for downgoing neutrinos, that is the ones that are coming down from the sky, you do get this ratio. But for upgoing neutrinos, since I explained that the Earth is basically like a sheet of glass, and neutrinos can mostly pass through it without any hindrance. For the upgoing neutrinos, you find the ratio is much closer to 1 instead of 2. So this is a very clear indication that along the path something has happened and your nu mu have decreased, and so there it's an clear evidence for neutrino oscillations. Now this ratio of 2 in fact is fairly robust, even if you look at some different model of how protons interact with the nuclei, you still get this number of 2. So this is a very clear evidence. The next evidence we have is from solar neutrinos. So this experiment was proposed by Davis and Bacall, which hinted at neutrino oscillations. So what they said was, you can calculate the number of neutrinos that you expect from the sun based on how the reaction rates. And when they do the experiment, they find that there's a shortfall in the number of neutrinos, and these are specifically electron neutrinos because those are the only ones that are produced in the nuclear reactions in the sun. So there's a shortfall by a factor of 2 or 3, and this they argued is an evidence for neutrino oscillations. However, at that time, most people did not believe in the result of this experiment for the simple reason that they claim that we don't know enough about the sun itself. So we can go wrong in estimating the nuclear reaction cross section, or you could go wrong in the modeling of the sun, since we don't know, we cannot determine the interior of the sun extremely well. So the major critique was that if you get the number within a factor of 10, you should be happy. So you should not quibble about a factor of 2 or 3. So at that point, this was not a very satisfactory evidence. However, then later you had further experiments done, reactor experiments, as well as the Sudbury Neutrino Observatory experiment, the SNO experiment, which has confirmed that the shortfall in electron neutrinos was because of nuclear oscillations. So the missing portion in the neutrino spectrum was recovered when you looked at the neutral current signal, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So both the experimenters for this, Kajita for the Super Kamiokande experiment and Arthur McDonald for the SNO experiment, got a Nobel Prize in 2015. And lastly, you have the accelerator-based disappearance experiments. So for first done by in Minos, and now of course we have many more accelerators. We have Nova, JPark, and Kamiokande. Kamiokande is a detector. So we have many experiments done now. So atmospheric neutrinos, I've already explained the mechanism for this. So you have this reaction, you produce pions, and it will give you the muon and nu mu, and that muon will further give you an electron and nu mu and a nu e. And depending on whether it's mu plus or mu minus, it will give you the corresponding products. Okay, so let us talk about the experiment at Super Kamiokande. So what happens over here is you have 50,000 tons of pure water in a chamber that is lined with photomultiplier tubes. And the reaction they look at is the charged current reaction. So you essentially want a nu E or a nu mu to interact with the oxygen nuclei in water to produce an electron or a muon, and which is then detected. Now, the electron or muon that is produced would go faster than the speed of light because of its high energy. It would go faster than the speed of light in the medium. So it would produce Cherenkov radiation, which is basically like a sonic beam. So you have a cone of light that is generated, and when you detect it along the walls of this container, you get a ring. And these are the rings. This is a ring corresponding on the left is corresponding to the muon event, and the right is corresponding to an electron event. We can distinguish between these because electron being lighter can get scattered much more easily. So you have a much more diffuse ring, while the muon has a fuzzy ring, and while the muon has a much sharper ring. So in this experiment, we use water, 50,000 tons of water. Why water? Because it is very cheap and we need a very pure water. So that's very easy to obtain. And the photomultiplier tubes. The photomultiplier tubes, also we need very pure water so that it does not absorb the light, because very little light is produced. We have around 300 photons per centimeter of the charged particle that travels. So a very small amount of light is produced. And the photomultiplier tubes, they only have about 15 to 20% efficiency. And even after that, they do not cover the entire surface area. So you need to really make sure that this light isn't absorbed. You have 10,000 photomultiplier tubes, which are about 50 centimeter in diameter. So yes, this is a photo of the photomultiplier tubes. You can see how big this chamber is, and it's filled with pure water. So this in this experiment, they do based on where you find the ring, you can find out which direction your new neutrino came from, and they do get a confirmation of the ratio that for downgoing neutrinos, you have a ratio of 2 nu mu to nu e, and for an upgoing neutrino, you have a ratio of 1. Then we come to solar neutrinos. So this is one chain of reactions that you can have inside the core of the sun. And over here, you see that mu e is produced at multiple steps. So these reactions, so since these are weak reactions, they occur at a very slow rate, and in fact, you even require quantum tunneling for that. And because of that, we have the long lifespan of the stars. That is why it's not in the order of days; it's in the order of billions of years. And the evidence of the fusion reactions are the neutrinos. So essentially, if you look at the sun, it's very difficult to find out about the interior of the sun by just analyzing the spectrum, because there's no way of X-raying the sun. But neutrinos, since they can pass through very easily, they give you a good idea of how the reactions, internal reactions are. And so you have these different experiments, uh, how much sensitive they are to the different reactions where nu is produced. Super Kamiokande and the snow experiment cannot. So the most populous nu E come from the PP experiment, the very first PP reaction, the very first reaction. So those are not detected, in fact, by the snow and Super Kamiokande experiment, but they're detected by the gallium experiment. All right. So if you look at this graph, this is you can see that the shortfall in nu E that you observe in these experiments. Over here, it's about a factor of 3. Over here, it's about a factor of 2 in the Kamiokande and the Super Kamiokande experiment. Then in the gallium one, which is a little more robust because it involves the PP electrons, the PP reaction neutrinos, you have again a shortfall of about a factor of 2. Then you have the snow experiment, so the one that provided the uh, biggest confirmation, because over here you had, though you had a shortfall of about a factor of 3 when you looked at only the electron type of neutrino, but the snow experiment was very smartly designed. It had so you, instead of water, they used D2O, and what happens is the deuteron has a very low binding energy, about an order of 2 MeV. So in this case, what happens is the neutrino can break up the deuteron, and you can detect this. And this does not depend on the type of neutrino. So you can detect not just the electron type of neutrino, you can detect all kinds of neutrinos, the muon and the tau neutrino as well. And then you recover all the missing neutrinos. And then this just confirms that the nu E was converted into some other form of neutrino, but they're all still there. So this confirms it confirms the standard solar model used by Bacall, and also confirms the theory of neutrino oscillations. Then you have reactor-based experiments. So for one example is the Kamlan detector. So this is a very interestingly located detector, since you can, the blue spots over here on the map are the nuclear reactors in Japan. So it is located in close proximity, about 100 to 200 kilometers from a lot of them. So you can have a great modulation of the neutrino spectrum. It can all of these act as sources for neutrinos, which this will detect. This is a liquid scintillator detector as compared to the snow experiment, which was a pure heavy water 1 kiloton detector. So this is a scintillator detector. And the bonus that you get is that the bonus that they got in this experiment was that this detector not only detected the neutrinos from the reactors, it also detected neutrinos from the uranium and thorium decays. So the uranium and thorium that is in the ground, essentially. So it detected, and even those go through decays, right? The chain, the reaction that they have, it includes beta decay. So the neutrinos from them were also detected, and the value that they got was extremely close to the model that they had the standard model for Earth. So you can see there's a very good agreement in the values over here, and this signal was consistent with what was expected. So finally, we come to accelerator-based experiments. So I won't go into too much detail into this, but the benefit of accelerator-based experiments is that you can control the energies of the neutrinos that you want, and you can get a concentrated beam of them instead of the random sample that we get from reactor-based or especially from atmospheric neutrinos. So you have a lot more control in accelerator-based experiments, and these are the ones that are mostly followed at Fermilab and all. Okay, so one example of an experiment that was done to directly weigh the neutrinos, since we don't know their masses. So one experiment that they're performing right now is with the Catron spectrometer. So what you can look at the size of this spectrometer. I won't go into the specific details of its functioning, but what it does is it will let us get a mass of the neutrino, or specifically the electron neutrino. So if you look at the spectrum, if you plot it in a certain way, what you'd find is if the neutrino were massless, it would just go on continuously and it would taper off. However, if they do have a finite mass, this graph would have it would have a non-zero slope. Slope becomes infinity and it stops at a certain point. It doesn't keep going. So if you know, this is extremely precise measurement. So you can see like from the overall graph, we take a very tiny portion and then you look at this. It's an extremely precise measurement. So what this spectrometer aims to do is, so currently we have the upper bound to be 2 electron volt for the electron type of neutrino. However, this experiment would reduce the upper bound by a factor of 10. It would bring it down to 0.2 eV per c squared. So now if the neutrino is actually lighter than that, then we would still not have an answer to that question, and we would, but we would have a better upper bound. However, if the mass of the neutrino does happen to be somewhere in between this range, say half an eV or 1 eV, then this would be extremely useful, and you would get the absolute mass, and correspondingly you can find the absolute mass for uh, the other neutrinos. So you can get M2 and M1 and M3. We still won't know until we get the mass ordering. All right. So moving on, we come to the India-based neutrino observatory that is currently in development. We have the location is it's in Tamil Nadu, 120-kilometer west of Madurai. And of course, this is going to be underground. They're going to build it under a 1 kilometer tall mountain. And it is going to be a 51,000 ton iron calorimeter neutrino detector, and will be the largest electromagnet in the world. And it will include about 30,000 glass RPCs. So here are some schematics. This is what the detector would look like. And this is the location. This is the mountain under which they're proposing to build it, a 1 kilometer tall mountain. In fact, you're going to build that even below. So you have 2 kilometers from the peak. All right. So moving on. So it is a collaboration between 28 institutes. You have all of these institutes, a couple of IITs, some other important institutes. You even have IISER Mohali. And these are some images of the prototypes for the RPC. So this is one RPC. I'll explain how that works. That was built. So why do we want to make such a huge magnet? This would be the largest electromagnet in the world. So why do we want to build an electromagnet? This is because neutrinos, first of all, need to interact with something. So they would interact with matter to produce the corresponding charged particle. This experiment would mostly focus on muon neutrinos. So you'll produce muons, mu plus and mu minus. And so the magnetic field would basically bend these in opposite directions. So you would be able to detect or identify whether it was a new mu or a new mu bar, or so basically whether it was a neutrino or an anti-neutrino. And so if you do this preliminary calculation, we expect 1 giga electron volt neutrino. So the mean free path happens to be 10 to the power 9 kilometers. And the probability of detection is this. So if you convert that in terms of days, we expect about 10 detections per day, yeah, at this uh, ex- uh, observatory. So why do we want to build this underground? So the most important reason is that the cosmic muons are a very important and a very huge background. So if as you saw in the last slide, we have 10 detections per day. Now, if you look at the number of cosmic muons, so we discussed the cosmic particles as in protons and stuff, but we also have muons, and those are about a couple hundred per meter square per second on the surface of the Earth. So that is a huge number, and 10 per day would basically, you would not be able to detect them at all if you were to conduct this experiment on the ground. So you conduct it underground. So 2 kilometers below the peak, you would have most of these muons would not be able to penetrate that deeply. So the detections you will know are caused by neutrino events and not because of the background muons. Then secondly, yes. So how deep? It's about 1 kilometer deep. So if 10 to the power 6 order of magnitude reduction in the background. So between a mine and a tunnel. So why did they choose a tunnel? Why are they planning to build a tunnel instead of doing it at a mine? That's because there are better logistics to do this at a tunnel. And also the location has also been very specifically chosen. The particular place that they're doing, it's of course seismically stable. Then it has very little flora and fauna, so it is you won't expect too much trouble from the environmentalists, and there isn't too much of vegetation as well. So we look at some of the schematics of the calorimeter. So how it works is you have multiple iron layers, and between that you have the RPCs. So the RPCs are basically two layers of glass, regular glass that we have in our windows, and in between that you have a gas layer. So when you have the charged particle that is created, so the neutrino will interact with the iron, it will produce a cobalt nucleus, and it will produce a muon. And this muon, when it will enter this chamber, so this RPC, it would, since it's charged and we have a very high voltage over here, so it would ionize the gas further, and then we would get a detectable signal. Now this whole thing has pickup strips in X and Y directions. So we would be able to detect the position of the muon in X and Y coordinates, and which layer this happens would give us the Z coordinate. So we would be able to trace the muon's path completely in X, Y, and Z coordinates. Of course, it has single muon has a very small charge, so that will be multiplied because of the high voltage and through the ionization, about 10 to the power 5 or 6 orders of magnitude. And you would get a measurable pulse in the order of nanoseconds. And then through that, you can get this detection. There are 64X strips and 64Y strips, so 128 channels and total of 30,000 RPCs. So this is a tracking detector. Okay, so again, why do we use iron? Iron is very reasonably cheap and it provides a material to interact. And also iron can be very easily magnetized. So you can produce the electromagnet, it will help with that as well. And you can detect whether it's just also a new mu or a new mu bar. And through this, in this experiment we can also use matter effects. And since using new mu, we can find out using matter effects, we'll be able to find distinguish between M3 and M2 and find the mass ordering for that as well. So if we go back to this slide, you have a graph of the data that they expect to collect. And within about 9 years, so on a standalone basis, 9 years of runtime, they expect to get a 3 sigma level of data to give an answer to as to the mass ordering of the neutrinos. And if you take the information of the data that's collected from the other experiments, the T2K and the NOVA experiments, then they would be able to do this. They would be able to achieve this in 6 years. So they'll get the definite mass ordering. They'll not get the absolute scale, but they at least get the mass ordering for that. So going ahead. Hmm. So at this detector, the energy ranges of the neutrinos that they expect to find out is in the order of GeV, 1 to 20 GeV. And the propagation length, so if you remember in the formula, these two things were important. They had a L by E factor. So the propagation lengths that they would get for these would be quite variable. So you have anywhere between 1 to 13,000 kilometers. Yes. So this should be 13,000 meters, sorry, 13 kilometers. So this is extremely useful because like in an accelerator based experiment, you would not be able to do this. You would have a fixed distance between the accelerator and then the detector, or even in a reactor based experiment. So this is extremely useful. So you get a good modulation. Then measurements, Toto did not distinguish between nu mu and nu mu bar. So again, this would be able to do that because you can track the muons, so you can track their direction and find out whether it was a mu plus or a mu minus, and then you can find out which neutrino it came from, a nu mu or a nu mu bar. And so these are the things that they want to achieve at this observatory. So first of all, most importantly, they want to find the mass ordering for the neutrinos, get a better values for the mixing parameters. Then they would also try to look for magnetic monopoles. So most likely, it's not expected that they would actually find magnetic monopoles, but they would improve the bounds by a factor of about 4 to 5. But who knows? There might be a discovery waiting there. Then next, they would search for the anomalous KGF event. So KGF stands for Kolar Gold Fields. So these are mines, and over there we had some anomalous experiments, anomalous observations that was found, and those haven't been explained yet. So they would try to explain those, whether they were real or they were just artifacts, and so on. More things that they would like to do. So the experiments planned at INO. So first of all, with the ICAL, of course, these are the ones that I stated. They were trying to do that. Then they also would try to find the neutrinoless double beta decay. So if they are able to detect this decay, then they would know that the neutrino is a Majorana fermion and it is its own antiparticle. So this is it's important that way. It's a Tintin. Then they would also there's a dark matter search using a cryogenic scintillator. Uh, then we have they also want to make a low energy accelerator for nuclear reaction cross section. So it's very difficult to estimate precisely what the nuclear reaction cross sections are. So this would most likely very help with that to get the values more precise. And finally, we come to the prototype that has been built at Madurai. So it is much smaller. You can have a look at the dimensions. And so what they tested with that is the performance of the magnet. So you measured the magnetic field using sense loop and Hall probes, and the performance of long period performance, long term performance of RPCs, and how the fringe field affects it, affects electronics, and so on. Then the feasibility of muon spin rotation for information about the magnetic field. So this is another method to detect, to measure the magnetic field, since we know that a muon has a charge, and a charged particle in a constant magnetic field would rotate in a circular orbit. So that is another way of detecting what the strength of the magnetic field is. So they tried doing this as well, and see if it's a workable method to measure. Then they compared the fluxes for mu plus and mu minus with simulations. And yes, so yeah, that's about it. So this is a graph of how the measurements look like. This is of course at not at the observatory itself. This is at the mini ICAL at Madurai. So you get data on the X and Y strips. So this is the X coordinate. This is a Y coordinate. Or you can see this goes to 64. And so you can see that you can detect, these are the points where you've detected the muon, and using the layer number you can find out the z coordinate as well. So when you combine these, you would get a very nice 3D plot of the trajectory of the muon. And this is a different example. So yes, now finally coming to the sources. So I've linked some of the papers that I used to gather information about this, and I would like to mention Professor V.M. Datar, the project director of the INO up till this year, July this year. So his talk was also very beneficial for me in collecting data for this. And that's it. Thank you. Now I would like to take whatever questions there are. Okay, so Yash Bhaiya has a question about, doesn't the standard model say that the neutrinos are massless? So precisely yes, the standard model does say that the neutrinos are massless, but neutrino oscillations are the primary evidence that they cannot be massless. So if you I showed that using the equation that I had over here, uh, this one. So if you see over here, uh, yeah, if the masses are zero, your delta m squared becomes zero, and if your delta m squared becomes zero, sine square zero is zero. This whole term goes away, and the probability of a certain type of neutrino being the same becomes one. So the very fact that it is not one, we have some disappearance of a certain kind of neutrino whenever we detect, is and so which points to neutrino oscillations. It is a proof that they must have some finite mass, and these masses must be different as well. Okay, so we have a question: if neutrinos oscillate and each has different mass, what happens to the excess energy, or how does the neutrino get excess energy? uh okay, so the excess energy is basically the becomes a kinetic energy, the excess, or if you go from a lighter to a heavier, then the kinetic energy is affected in a very simple way. Yeah. So of course it doesn't get mass out of thin air, or energy out of thin air. That is a very, that is a valid point. Yes, the velocity would change along the way. We can't look at a single neutrino and then observe it. So it's not a very precise answer, but that is what I would expect. Yes. So what do the different colors in Cherenkov ring indicate? Okay, so these colors are okay. I'll come to that slide. These colors are not the actual color of the light that was seen. This is not an actual image of the container, isn't it? This color represents the intensity of light at different points. That can be due to very different factors. It doesn't have to be very, the exact same in each direction. So you can see on you have a scale over here, and it tells you at different frequencies or different what is the intensity of the light. So it's not very uniform. You have a kind of a modulation. The difference is not too much, but you do have some difference. So this isn't the color of the light actually. The light itself is mostly blue. Yeah. Okay. So any other questions? Is there any specific reason as to why electron ring scatters more? So yes, I actually explained that. Over here, what happens is the electron is much lighter than the muon. So for the charged leptons, we do know the masses very precisely, right? So the electron is much lighter than the muon, so it can get scattered. So after all, this is experiment is being conducted in water, right? So the electron get scattered as it moves, and because of that, of course the ring would also be affected. The Cherenkov light, the cone that is produced, would be affected, so you get a much more fuzzy ring, while for muon, which is much heavier, it scatters very little, so you get a much more defined or much sharper ring. I hope that answers your question. Okay, anything else?
Well, I guess there are no more questions.
All right, then I think we should wrap up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Vedant. That was such a nice talk.
Thank
And
you.
okay, have a great evening.
Okay, goodbye.